Arya Stark remembered the taste of salt in the sea air and the winds that swept through Winterfell's courtyard. She could recall every face she loved, every name she chanted on her restless nights, every pang of longing that had once guided her steps. But memories were delicate things, easily frayed and easily misshapen by time and fate. Now, in her mind's eye, those recollections seemed like tattered banners fluttering in a rising storm, barely recognizable. Something else had taken root in her, a distant and echoing voice that spoke to her in moments of darkness, guiding her toward a place she never wanted to go. It had begun so subtly she could scarcely name the day or the hour, but from the first time she sensed that cold presence within her, a tiny crack formed in the shell of her heart. It was during the last stand at the Godswood, when the living confronted the Night King and his endless ranks of the dead. They had all seen the cold menace on his inhuman face. Arya had been the one to slip behind him, the one who held the dagger of Valyrian steel. She had leapt from the darkness, the same stroke that saved Bran Stark, her brother, from icy annihilation. She had been the hero in that breath of time, or so the legends would say. But as soon as her blade pierced the Night King, there was a moment, scarcely more than a flicker, when his icy blue eyes met hers. In that instant, Arya felt a surge of indescribable cold, a presence that slammed into her soul. She felt him and he felt her. Ice became dust in her hand. That monstrous, ancient creature shattered into countless shards, along with the whites and White Walkers. All around her, the long night had ended. She was the victor, hailed by the living as the one who had struck down the greatest foe that Westeros had known in thousands of years. No one suspected that in meeting his gaze, in connecting with the Night King's dark essence at that fatal moment, Arya Stark had invited a fragment of something terrible into her spirit. No one suspected the slip in her heart, the jagged possibility that perhaps the Night King had not died at all, but was carried, in pieces, within the girl who had struck the killing blow. It was over then, or so they believed, and life went on. Rebuilding, mourning, celebrations and funerals alike. Arya felt it at first as a kind of cold ache behind her eyes, or a freezing numbness in her palms when she held her blade. At night she slept restlessly, dreaming of a great white plain and a frozen silhouette of a tree with ravens perched upon it. No leaves, only silent watchers under pale moonlight. She dismissed these nightmares, for there were many horrors that war had carved upon her mind. She told no one. She told herself it was nothing. Slowly, life carried her from one place to another. She traveled south as she had once dreamed. She returned briefly to King's Landing, hoping to stand in the city she had once hated and see it anew. She greeted old friends, parted ways with them again, always searching for something she could not name, and the sense of that presence gnawed at her. She had always been drawn to the Godswood, to the quiet presence of the weirwood trees, yet now it was different. In the hush of those sacred spaces, she could almost hear a voice calling out to her. It was quieter than a whisper, older than any living memory, and it resonated with that monstrous cold in her veins. She did not speak of it. She did not wish to alarm her family, the ones she had fought so hard to protect. She told herself that if she ignored it, it would pass. But the fragment of the Night King was patient. It did not rampage in her mind or take immediate control, but coiled there like a serpent in winter, gathering its strength. Arya's will was strong, a fortress built of heartbreak, training, and iron-hard resolve. The darkness within her had to wait until a moment of weakness, a moment of fear or sorrow so profound that it could slip its talons deeper into her soul. That moment came when word reached her of further troubles beyond the wall. She had thought the threat banished, but newly arrived wildlings told tales of strange sightings in the polar wastes, rumors of creeping shadows that devoured entire villages. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch dispatched patrols. News of skirmishes with undead remnants made their way south. No one believed a new army of the dead could arise so soon, yet the bits and pieces of rumor wove a tapestry of dread. Something was happening in the north once more. Against her better judgment, Arya offered her services. It was in her nature to act, to see with her own eyes, to fight if needed. She told herself she was hunting ghosts, She told herself that if any vestige of the Night King's power survived, she would see it ended. So, she rode north with a company of the Night's Watch, accompanied by a handful of trusted companions. They slipped through the gate in the wall and entered the bitter tundra of the true north. The journey was brutal. Winds screamed over frozen rivers, and the nights pressed in too quickly. Each day was an ordeal of cutting cold, made only slightly more bearable by the presence of her companions. Men of the Night's Watch, loyal and stalwart, trudged alongside her. One or two recognized her from rumors of her valor in the war for the dawn. They treated her with hushed respect, wary of the deadly girl who had ended the Night King. Still, there was camaraderie enough around the small campfires. It felt almost pleasant to be regarded without scorn or suspicion. For once, Arya let her guard down a fraction. The deeper they traveled, the more she felt that cold presence thrumming in her chest. At night, she could scarcely keep her teeth from chattering. She dreamed of shapes moving through swirling snow, flickers of blue eyes, a silent legion waiting beyond mortal vision. But the strangest dream of all repeated itself. She stood in a clearing of virgin snow where a single weirwood tree grew, branches red and twisted, faces carved in the bark. The wind howled, and from behind the tree stepped a figure whose silhouette was as dark as shadow, crowned with icy horns. She would raise her dagger against him, but in these dreams, he only gazed at her with those dead, implacable eyes. Then the figure reached out a hand, and a hush fell upon the world. Days of travel became weeks. The band found deserted wildling camps, footprints in the snow that led nowhere, half-buried bones. Something was stalking these lands. More than once, Arya thought she glimpsed figures in the distance, too far to see clearly but eerily still. The men muttered. Some suggested turning back. Their numbers dwindled as frostbite and exhaustion took their toll. But Arya insisted they push on, convinced that they must find the source of these rumors. Convinced that if there was any trace of the Night King's magic left, she had a duty to stop it. It was in a valley of ice-veiled pines that they first came under attack. Snow whirled so thickly it was impossible to see more than a few yards. The whites emerged without warning, silent as they had always been. Half-rotted forms, each animated by the bitter kiss of death. The men fought bravely with flaming torches and steel. Arya danced among them with lethal grace, her dagger of Valyrian steel slicing undead flesh. She felt the old spark of fury and clarity. Killing these creatures felt like an echo of her purpose. She had done it before and she would do it again. The whites fell under their combined assault. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the undead withdrew into the storm. They had lost 3 men in that ambush. The survivors regrouped, shaken, some wounded. Fear took hold of them, fear that they had arrived at something worse than rumor. What if a new army of the dead had truly begun to form, rallying under some new being of frost and shadow? They dared not speak it aloud, but all eyes turned to Arya. She saw their silent plea. Please, do what you did before. End this. She felt the heavy weight of their faith. She had never asked to be anyone's savior. She had only done what she had to do once upon a time. Now these men pinned their hopes on her, as if it were her destiny. But in the night that followed, she woke in a cold sweat from a dream. She had dreamed of the dead rising, an army without number, and at their head a figure that wore a face she knew. It was her own face, frosted white, vacant as the grave. She sat up, blinking tears from her eyes. The wind hissed outside, and for an instant, she could have sworn she heard a voice whisper her name. She peered into the darkness. The camp was silent save for the shifting and mumbling of sleeping men. She tried to calm her breathing, yet inside her chest, that cold presence coiled tighter, and a wave of nausea hit her. For a moment, she wanted to flee back south to abandon this quest. But no, she was Arya Stark of Winterfell. She had faced death too many times to run from it now. They pressed on, losing 2 more to the cold and to scattered white attacks. Then, at last, they came upon a hidden valley deeper in the uncharted wilderness. There, the landscape opened to reveal a frozen lake, ringed by jagged rocks. At the center, a tiny island of ice stood like a stage, and there, upon that island, they saw a figure waiting. Night enveloped them too quickly to make a move that day, and the men huddled on the rocky slope, uncertain. In the dim starlight, Arya peered at the figure. It stood upright, unmoving, clad in tattered black that might have once been furs. She could not see its face clearly, but the presence in her chest howled in recognition. Something was calling to her, beckoning her to approach. In the morning, the men formed a line and advanced carefully across the lake, weapons at the ready. Arya walked at their head. As they neared, they saw the figure more clearly. It was one of the dead, pale and unmoving, a wildling man whose jaw hung open in silent horror. Yet he did not lurch toward them or screech. He simply stood, and when they reached the island, they found something far more terrible behind him. As they stepped onto the slick ice, emerging from a swirl of blowing snow, they saw a great, misshapen mound of corpses, half buried in the frost. Scores of eyes, open and unseeing, stacked in a grotesque pyramid. The stench was faint, dulled by the cold, but it was still overwhelming enough to make a few men retch. A hush settled over the company. Then, with a crack, the lone standing corpse shuddered. Its glassy eyes flickered with an eerie blue glow, and from the mound rose more shapes. One by one, the corpses stood, eyes igniting with that familiar, ghastly radiance, as though awakened by some silent command. Arya and her companions raised their weapons. There were too many to count. This was no handful of wandering wights. It was the beginning of a new legion. Her heart pounded, but some part of her remained steady, slipping instinctively into the faceless man's lethal calm. She brandished her Valyrian steel dagger. The men fanned out around her. They set torches alight, prepared to burn whatever came at them. But instead of attacking, the newly risen wights parted, forming a wide corridor on the ice. In the center of that corridor, another figure appeared, silent and stately, gliding across the frozen lake. She wore the tattered remnants of a black cloak, her skin pale as moonlight, and upon her brow a rim of icy horns. She was tall, impossibly tall, with flowing white hair that snapped in the wind. Her eyes burned blue, as the Night King's had. She looked upon Arya, and a slow smile curved her cracked lips. The watchers were too stunned to move. Fear seized them. They had heard of White Walkers, the inhuman masters of the Whites, but none had ever imagined a figure like this. She did not strike with a weapon. Instead, she spoke, her voice coming out as a hollow echo. "I have waited." For an instant, Arya could not speak. The presence inside her twisted, as though it recognized its kin. There was an unspoken language in that moment, a cold resonance that passed between Arya and this pale figure. The men around Arya trembled. A few stepped backward, uncertain whether to flee or attack. The pale woman inclined her head, as though acknowledging Arya's valor or her station. "Daughter of Death," she said in a voice like cracking ice, "the great Other's champion. I have waited for you." Confusion warred with dread in Arya's mind. She wanted to say that she was no champion of any great other. She was Arya Stark. She served the living. She had once served the many-faced god. She had ended the Night King's reign of terror. But her tongue felt numb in her mouth, and the cold presence inside her flared, almost hungrily. At once, the whites stirred. The pale woman lifted a hand, and the dead shambled aside even farther, clearing a path that led beyond the island to a rocky crevice that cut through the valley wall. She turned away, gliding in that direction. Her voice carried over the wind. "Come, daughter of death, let me show you what you have awakened." Arya hesitated only an instant before she ran after the woman. The men shouted after her. Some called her name, some yelled in alarm, but Arya's feet carried her forward. She did not know why she followed, only that she had to see. Within the crevice, darkness awaited. The pale woman entered, followed by Arya, her breath hissing in the cold. The flickering torchlight from the men behind her cast wavering shadows. Inside, the passage opened into a subterranean chamber carved of ice and rock. Pale glimmers of daylight filtered down through cracks overhead, illuminating what lay within. There, she saw a shrine of sorts, an altar of black ice, and on it a twisted crown made of frozen horns. Behind the altar was a great weirwood throne, stained black with congealed blood. The air reeked of ancient death. Arya could only stare in horror. The pale woman stood before the altar and turned to Arya. Blue light shone in her eyes as though kindled from some deep well of power. "You thought he was undone," the woman said, "but you carry him piece by piece. That which cannot die merely waits for rebirth." Arya forced words out of her tight throat. "I killed the Night King. He's gone." She wanted to sound defiant, but her voice faltered. A laugh like frozen leaves rustled from the pale woman's lips. "Gone? A morsel of the great other's might lingers in you. Each night it grows. Did you never wonder why your dreams are so cold? Child, why the winds speak your name?" She reached out a hand, and Arya felt that same savage pull in her heart, as if some invisible chain linked them. "He has chosen you, his champion." Arya shook her head, stepping back. "No, I am no champion." She willed her body to move, her mind to fight, but it was as if the very air weighed her down. Every step felt heavier than the last. "I serve the living." The pale woman's eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. "Not anymore." In that instant, she lunged. Arya barely managed to raise her dagger. Their weapons clashed, Valyrian steel on ice-forged blade. The shock of impact reverberated up Arya's arm. She ducked and spun, using the training that had guided her countless times. The pale woman was fast, inhumanly so, gliding as though the laws of gravity had no hold on her. She struck again, forcing Arya to yield ground until she stood near the altar. Outside, Arya could hear the shouts of the men, the ring of steel as more whites attacked. The entire valley must have erupted into chaos. Arya parried again, her breath streaming in white clouds. The pale woman's face betrayed no fear or anger, only a measured intensity, as though testing Arya's strength. And with each stroke, that cold presence inside Arya stirred, as if it yearned to be unleashed. Finally, Arya found an opening and slashed. The Valyrian steel bit into the pale woman's arm. A hiss of frosty mist escaped, but the wound did not bleed red. The woman snarled a whisper of something in an unknown language. A wave of cold exploded outward, knocking Arya back. She slammed against the altar, momentarily dazed. The pale woman's blade shot forward, poised to impale Arya's heart. But then came an echo in Arya's mind. Images of her father's face, her mother's embrace, Jon's smile, Sansa's hand in hers. She had not fought this long to fall to darkness now. She twisted aside at the last moment. Her dagger came up, and she drove it into the pale woman's chest. She pushed until the hilt nearly touched flesh. A shriek split the air as the pale woman staggered backward. That ghastly cry reverberated, shaking ice from the cavern walls. Arya rose, cold sweat dripping from her brow, preparing to finish her. But the pale woman's eyes flickered. She staggered away, half collapsing near the altar, the black crown behind her. Wisps of ice and steam rose from the wound. Her expression twisted into an unholy grin. "You cannot stop what you have already begun," she rasped. "Strike me down if you must. Another will come for you." Arya gripped the dagger, heart pounding, wishing she could drive it in deeper. She forced out words, her voice trembling with anger. "He died by my hand. He won't have me." The woman laughed again, spitting out black frost. "Then run, little wolf. Run as far as you like. But in the end you will kneel. The great other has chosen you." She closed her eyes, letting out one final choking breath. Then her body fell silent, the eerie blue glow snuffed out. The chamber seemed to darken as though a lantern had been extinguished. Arya stood there, chest heaving, the dagger clutched in her white-knuckled grip. She stared at the body, half expecting it to rise again, to keep fighting. But it lay still. She realized her breaths were shallow, her gaze riveted on the black crown behind the altar. For an instant, she imagined herself taking it, placing it upon her brow. A wave of cold so fierce it almost blinded her crashed through her mind. She forced herself to tear her eyes away. She rushed out of the chamber, back through the crevice to find that the men had driven off the whites with fire and steel. 2 more had died in the battle. Their remains lay in the red-stained snow. The whites that had not been destroyed now lay motionless, as if the pale woman's death had cut their strings. A hush of dread settled upon the survivors as they gazed at Arya, who emerged from the passage trembling and pale. She did not speak of what she had learned, only declared that the threat was contained. None dared question her. In their eyes, she was the hero once again, slayer of whatever new White Walker sought to rally the dead. They did not see the haunted look in her eyes, or how she shivered uncontrollably as they marched away from the Valley of Ice. She did not tell them about the voice that had echoed in her ears, or how that presence within her burned colder than ever, a silent frost that gnawed at the edges of her mind. By the time they returned south, it was late winter, and the men dispersed to bring word of their deed. Word spread that Arya Stark had once more ended a grave threat. But Arya herself took no comfort in these rumors. She traveled alone, moving from outpost to outpost, seeking answers. Each night, her dreams became more vivid. She dreamed of the weirwood tree again, of hands of ice gently cradling her face. The face of the Night King flickered in her vision, but now it melded with her own reflection. Each morning, she awoke with a gasp, her heart pounding. She felt a creeping sense of inevitability, as though she were walking down a long hallway that led to a single locked door, and the key was in her pocket. She tried to confide in no one but soon she found herself at the gates of Winterfell again, drawn home as though by an invisible tether. She told herself that if there was any place she could banish these nightmares, it would be here, among her family. She walked through the courtyard, exchanging nods with guards who greeted her warmly, some calling her the hero or the White Wolf. She had never grown accustomed to titles. Sansa was waiting in the great hall, a look of relief on her face. The Lady of Winterfell embraced her sister, though Arya stood stiffly in her arms. Sansa sensed the tension. It worried her, but she chose not to press, focusing instead on how glad she was for Arya's return. She led Arya to a private solar where the 2 sisters sat before a warm hearth, the wind rattling the shutters outside. Sansa offered tea, which Arya sipped without tasting. Sansa asked about rumors of undead in the far north, about the new White Walker threat. Arya answered with half-truths. Yes, there had been a confrontation, but she had dispatched it. No, she was fine, just weary. She did not want to burden Sansa with what churned in her mind. But Sansa had always been perceptive in her own way. She pressed her sister gently, voice full of concern. You've changed, Arya, even more than before. What happened out there? Arya wanted to unburden herself, to confess the nightmares, the voice, the awful sense of fate closing in. She wanted to say, I think I brought something back with me when I killed the Night King. But fear choked her. She worried that if she spoke of it, the cold inside her would awaken fully, and that it would be unstoppable. So instead, she only shook her head and said, It's nothing. I just need rest. Sansa studied her for a long moment but finally yielded. Then rest. Stay as long as you like. Winterfell is your home. Her smile was sad, as though suspecting that the bond they shared had drifted further than she wished. That night, Arya slept in her old chambers, the ones she had once occupied as a child. The room felt alien, as though it belonged to another life. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the hush of Winterfell's nights. Ghostly shapes of memory swirled. Her lessons at needlework with Sansa, archery practice with Bran, the whistling of the wind in the crypts. She remembered her father's voice. She remembered how it felt to be fearless, to be the girl who wanted to see the world and become a knight, or a water dancer, or anything but a proper lady. Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and hot. Somewhere in the quiet of the night, she heard a faint whisper, a name. She sat up, heart pounding, sure that someone stood outside her door calling to her, but she found only a cold corridor. She returned to bed, unsettled. She drifted into uneasy slumber. And then the dream came again. She stood in front of a weirwood tree, the bark white as bone, the carved face weeping sap of darkest red. Snow fell all around. And from behind the trunk stepped the shape of a man wreathed in frozen armor. The horns upon his head glistened like black ice. His face was a mask of quiet power. He was the Night King, yet not as she remembered him. A presence older, crueler, and somehow more intimate. He raised his hand, and in that moment Arya realized she wanted to take it. Part of her yearned for that cold touch, yearned to kneel. His eyes were infinite, starless wells, promising an end to fear, an end to pain. She woke gasping, drenched in sweat. The wind howled outside. Winterfell felt too warm, the blanket stifling. She crawled from bed and paced, fists clenched. She whispered to herself that she would not yield. But with each passing day, she felt more tension in her limbs. She snapped at the castle staff, withdrew from Sansa's attempts at conversation, and avoided the curious gazes of guards. She spent hours in the Godswood, kneeling before the old weirwood tree, as though searching for some sign that the old gods could help her. But all she heard was the incessant call of that colder presence, calling her deeper. Eventually, she left Winterfell without explanation, riding north again. She could not remain idle. If there was truly a piece of the Night King in her, she had to find a way to tear it out. She thought perhaps she would seek the children of the forest, if any remained, or the three-eyed raven's knowledge in the far corners of the land. She traveled swiftly, slipping past the wall once more. Rumors came to her of an abandoned cave where strange carvings hinted at ancient spells. Others spoke of ghostly lights drifting through the haunted forest, or an undead bear that roamed near an ice-rimmed river. Desperate for anything that might lead her to answers, she followed every lead. Her journey yielded only more despair. She found the cave in question, but it was collapsed and empty. The haunted forest was indeed haunted by maddening echoes that led nowhere. She hunted the undead bear, fought it, killed it, but the cold presence within her only seemed to grow stronger as though feeding on each confrontation. Its voice became clearer, at times urging her to speak incantations she did not understand. She began to realize that she was not alone. Sometimes, in the distance, she saw wights shadowing her path, as though escorting her. They never drew near, never attacked. They merely stood on the horizon or behind the trees, watching. Terrified her more than open aggression. There was a sense of inevitability. They were waiting for her to accept them, to command them. She refused. She fled deeper into wilderness, trying to outrun her fate. One night, she sought shelter in the hollow of a dead oak. Snow battered the land. She built a small fire from twigs, huddling around the flickering flames. As the wind howled, shapes of blue-white drifted closer, forming a silent ring beyond the dim light of her camp. The whites. She saw their glowing eyes, but they did not charge. They merely stood vigil in the snow, like loyal guardians. Arya gripped her dagger, trembling. She wanted to kill them all, but exhaustion weighed on her. She was so tired of fighting. Why did they not attack? She forced herself to remain awake, determined to defend herself if they advanced. The wind scoured her cheeks, the cold creeping through her bones. But soon, she found her eyelids drooping. Her thoughts grew sluggish. The presence in her mind whispered, "Sleep, let us in." She fought it, but her fatigue was overwhelming. At last, she succumbed, slumping against the trunk of the oak, the flames guttering low. In her dreams, she walked across a vast plain of ice under a moonless sky. The ground shimmered under her feet. Far ahead, she saw a solitary figure, dark silhouettes of horns crowning his head. The Night King beckoned. She approached, teeth chattering. Yet she could not stop her feet from carrying her forward. When she was close, he reached out a hand, as he had so many times in her nightmares. For a moment, she was the terrified girl in Harrenhal, the lost traveler in Bravos, the child who had never quite found her place among the living. She placed her hand in his, and cold shot through her veins like lightning. She gasped, But it was not pain. It was relief. She felt all the burdens of memory, of loss, of heartbreak, seep away. A curious numbness took its place. He drew her close, tilting her chin until she stared into his infinite, deathly eyes. In the reflection of those eyes, she saw herself crowned with ice, an entire realm bowing in frozen submission. She awoke with a scream that the wind tore away. The whites still stood in their circle, motionless. Dawn's pale light stained the horizon. She felt tears on her cheeks and a tremor in her arms. Fear warred with a strange longing. The dream's promise had felt so real, so seductive. Is that what she wanted? To be free from the ghosts of her past, to never feel the pain of longing or regret again. She forced herself upright, stoked the embers of her small fire into flame once more, determined to push away the cold, if only for a little while. She repeated the names of her family like a mantra. She would not yield. She was Arya Stark. She had always known how to stand alone, how to survive. Even so, the presence within her felt stronger than ever, as though the Night King was just behind her, whispering in her ear. She made one final attempt to seek help beyond the wall. She discovered a ragged band of wildlings who had heard ancient tales from the children of the forest. They spoke of a heart tree in a lost valley that might answer her questions. Eager for any hope, Arya ventured there, pushing through storms and ice-laden passes, wading across half-frozen rivers until her skin turned raw and her horse died beneath her from exhaustion. She continued on foot, half delirious with cold, until at last she found the valley. A hidden grove ringed by towering pines, at the center of which stood a massive weirwood, ancient beyond reckoning, gnarled and twisted, its trunk carved with a sorrowful face. Exhausted, half-frozen, she collapsed against the roots of that colossal tree, heart hammering. The presence within her pulsed, as if excited. "We are here," it whispered. She leaned her forehead against the bark, feeling the texture of the weirwood's ancient wisdom beneath her skin. She did not know what to do, so she did what she had never done before. She prayed, quietly, desperately. She begged the old gods for guidance, for a release from the darkness within her. At first, there was only silence. Then, she felt a stirring, as though the tree itself inhaled. The carved face seemed to shift, the lines of its mouth curving in sorrow. She felt a presence, not cold, but ancient and slow, brushing against her consciousness like leaves in a gentle wind. She sensed curiosity, concern, and something akin to heartbreak. Then the wind whistled through the branches, forming words in her mind, or perhaps an echo of words long forgotten. "He lies within you, a seed of ice, growing. We cannot uproot it." Tears came unbidden to Arya's eyes. "Then what can I do?" she whispered, voice breaking. "I killed him once. Why can't I kill him again?" The branches rattled overhead in a mournful hush. The presence in the weirwood seemed to struggle, as if searching for an answer. Then, like a sigh, she heard the faintest whisper. "He is bound to you, the slayer who became the cradle of his rebirth. Cut him out, and you cut out your own heart." She clutched at the bark, desperation clawing at her. There must be a way. There has to be. Silence. The presence receded, leaving behind only the faint hint of sorrow. Arya sank to her knees, burying her face in her hands, overcome by the futility. A part of her had suspected this answer, that once she had taken the Night King into herself, there was no simple undoing. The weirwood offered no solution, only a confirmation of her worst fear. She remained in that grove for hours, until dusk crept across the sky. Then, with trembling resolve, she rose to leave. She knew then that she could not remain in hiding, nor could she ask her family to face the possibility of her corruption. She did not want to return to Winterfell. She did not want them to see the monstrous fate looming over her. Perhaps, she thought, if she went far away, to sea, to Essos, to lands beyond the known world, she could keep this darkness at bay. Perhaps distance and solitude would keep Westeros safe. If she died alone, so would the seed within her. But the seed of the Night King had other plans. That night, as she prepared a small camp near the grove, a new wave of whites arrived. At least 24, marching from the snow-laden trees, their eyes fixed on her. They did not attack. They stood in a semicircle, parting to allow a single figure to pass. A white walker, clad in icicle armor, black horns adorning its helm. He carried a spear of ice, his eyes blazing the same eerie blue. He leveled the spear at Arya, as though commanding her attention. Arya stood, knife in hand, but something was different. She felt a wave of cold around her, pressing down, and with it came a flood of calm. She tried to muster her rage to strike at the White Walker. Instead, she felt her limbs grow still. Her heart pounded once, twice, then slowed. A voice inside her mind murmured, "Submit," and she felt an almost physical push. Her knees trembled, threatening to buckle. For an instant, the face of everyone she had loved flashed before her eyes. She clung to their memory, fighting to stand. The White Walker lowered his spear, studying her silently. Then, as if reaching a conclusion, he turned and walked back into the trees. The whites followed, fading into the darkness. Arya was left trembling, tears on her cheeks once again. She understood then that they could claim her at any time. They were waiting for her to break. She fled south, forcing her body beyond the brink of exhaustion, traveling day and night on foot. But as she moved, she realized the land itself was changing. It was still deep winter, but there was an unnatural chill in the air, sharper than any northern cold she had known. Streams froze solid overnight, thick as a millstone. Herds of animals lay stiff in the fields, glazed in frost. The small folk whispered of an endless winter, as though the great other had never truly been banished. Some believed the Night King was returning. Others scoffed at such talk, trusting that Arya Stark's victory had secured them peace. She came across villages half buried in snow, roads deserted or blocked by ice. Whispers followed her name. Some recognized her, asking if she was there to save them once again. She could only shake her head, her eyes distant. How could she admit that she was the very herald of doom? Eventually, she reached a small holdfast not far from the last hearth. By then, her ragged appearance and the haunted look in her eyes frightened the guards, but they allowed her entry upon learning she was Arya Stark. She asked only for a place to sleep. The holdfast's castellan was a stout man who offered her warm food and a bed for the night. She accepted numbly. In the morning, she awoke to a horrific wailing. She rushed outside to find the courtyard swarming with whites, their eyes glowing in the gray dawn. The guards fought valiantly but were overwhelmed. Screams echoed. She drew her dagger, cutting down every undead shape that lunged for her. But it was like trying to hold back the tide. They were too many. The castle folk pleaded for help, crying, "Lady Stark, save us." She fought as hard as she could, leaving piles of corpses in her wake, but still they advanced. Then, in the swirl of chaos, she felt it, an icy command within her mind. She realized with horror that the whites were parting for her, letting her stand at the center of the courtyard, untouched, while the living fell around her. She spun, delirious with fury, slicing through the ranks of the dead. She killed 12, 24, but it made no difference. She was drowning in an ocean of them. The living screamed. Flames guttered out. Then suddenly all fighting ceased. The whites froze in place, turning to stare at the gate as it opened with a thunderous boom. Outside, a figure strode into the courtyard. Another White Walker, tall and lean, with a crown of ice. Not the same as the one she had seen before, but no less terrifying. He pointed a crystal sword at Arya. She felt a jolt, as though her heart was caught in a vice. The whites around them all sank to their knees in unison. In that moment, something inside Arya cracked. She heard a voice hissing, "Submit," and the memory of her father, mother, siblings, and friends flared, only to be consumed by swirling frost. She dropped to one knee, tears streaming, her dagger falling from her limp fingers. She heard her own voice moan, "No," but her body was not her own. The White Walker stepped forward, its eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. Wordlessly, it extended a taloned hand, placing icy fingertips on her forehead. Pain speared her mind. A torrent of images rushed in. The first long night, the forging of the Night King, the countless ages of death, the endless war between light and darkness. She saw the Great Other's malignant will, saw how it had chosen her as its vessel, the slayer turned champion, a perfect irony. She saw the White Walkers as an army of watchers, each with a shard of this primeval force, each awaiting the Great Other's final harvest of souls. She saw entire cities caked in ice, the sun devoured by permanent darkness, a hush upon the world under an endless sea of undead. And in the epicenter of that quiet apocalypse, she saw herself, crowned with black ice, an endless legion kneeling before her. She could not fight it anymore. The last shred of her defiance shriveled under that cosmic cold. The White Walker hissed, withdrawing its hand. Arya remained kneeling, her eyes fixed on the snow. A hush fell upon the courtyard. Slowly, she stood, and the whites around her also rose, awaiting her will. The White Walker inclined its head, as if in deference to a superior. Arya Stark's eyes shone with a faint blue glow. The courtyard was silent but for the ragged breathing of the few living survivors, too petrified to flee. She turned and looked upon them. They stared in horror, their mouths open but voiceless. She recognized them. The castellan who had given her lodging, the guards who had tried to protect her, a woman clutching a child. Once, Arya's heart would have broken to see them in peril. Now, though she remembered the shape of that emotion, the feeling was distant, a memory fading like old paint. She almost wished she could comfort them, but the chill inside her commanded otherwise. She heard the voice inside, telling her what must be done. With the barest flick of her hand, she commanded the whites. They fell upon the survivors, devouring them in a frenzy of frozen claws. Arya did not flinch, though her body trembled with the echo of a revulsion she could no longer fully claim. She closed her eyes and allowed the final vestige of warmth to slip away, drowned in the Great Other's embrace. Soon, the screams subsided. The courtyard lay thick with bloody corpses. The whites stood still, breathing in silence. Arya opened her eyes, and the White Walker knelt, presenting her dagger of Valyrian steel back to her. The same dagger she had used to kill the Night King. The irony cut through her like a shard of broken glass. The White Walker bowed its head. She took the dagger, feeling the coldness of its metal, which no longer burned her hand. She felt only numb acceptance. A whisper in her mind said, "It is time." She knew what she had to do. She was the champion of the Great Other now, the new Night Queen, or whatever name the living would call her. She felt a dark power swirl in her chest, a tide that would not be denied. Her destiny was clear. She left the holdfast with her new retinue of undead, heading south. As she marched, the circle of whites grew. She did not need to speak commands. The cold presence in her mind guided them, raising new corpses from every village they crossed, absorbing every lost traveler who died in the snow. There was no mad rush, no mindless wave of destruction. Rather a slow, inexorable advance, as though winter itself had decided to walk. Trees drooped under the weight of ice. The sky fell into perpetual twilight, and the living shivered behind their walls, ignorant of the horror that approached. In time, word spread that a new threat roamed the north. Raven messages flew. The lords and ladies of Westeros, battered from the previous war, read accounts of villages destroyed overnight by an army of whites. Rumors claimed that the White Walkers had returned, led by a dark-haired woman whose eyes blazed with blue fire. Some named her a ghost, a specter of the old wars. Others laughed it off as superstition. But many had learned that ignoring warnings was folly. They prepared to fight. Winterfell was among the first to receive these ravens. Sansa read them with a rising dread. She realized with a sinking heart that the timeline of these attacks aligned with the last time she had seen Arya. A horrifying possibility took shape in her mind. Could the unstoppable champion be her sister? She refused to believe it at first, but the name She-Wolf of Winter had appeared in more than one desperate note. She summoned the lords loyal to the Starks, rallying them to man the walls of Winterfell once again. Bran, the three-eyed raven, had long since journeyed away, seeking mysteries beyond mortal ken. Jon was in the south negotiating alliances. So Sansa stood alone, the Lady of Winterfell, her face grim as she prepared for the unthinkable. Days later, the great northern fortress stood ready. Archers lined the battlements. Trenches were dug, filled with oil-soaked kindling. The watchers kept vigil day and night, scanning the horizon for a sign of the undead horde. Tension weighed heavily. Memories of the last long night haunted each defender. Some prayed to the old gods, some to the Seven, some to the Red God, seeking any crumb of hope. Then, one gray morning, the horns sounded. The watchers saw movement in the distance. Dark shapes, hundreds, then thousands, covering the snow like ants. The whites advanced in silence. Sansa stood on the ramparts, cloak billowing, face pale but determined. She saw something else as well, a single rider moving at the forefront. Even from afar, Sansa could see the rider's dark hair and slender build. Tears sprang to her eyes. She tried to steel herself. The whites halted some distance from the walls. The rider dismounted. She was dressed in black leathers and furs, rimed with frost. Her eyes burned like pale sapphires. She walked forward alone, stopping before the trench. Sansa commanded her archers to hold their fire, unable to believe what she was seeing. Was there still a chance to save her sister? Arya stared up at the walls of Winterfell, feeling an echo of memories stir. This had been her home. Here she had been a child. The name Arya Stark remained in her mind like a half-forgotten lullaby. The presence inside her whispered, "Command them to open the gates. Let them submit." She could sense the living behind those walls, sense their fear, their heartbreak. She raised her voice, calling out in a tone that resonated with an otherworldly chill. "Sansa," she said, "I am here." Atop the battlements, Sansa closed her eyes, tears slipping free. Her voice cracked as she called down, "Arya, come inside. We can help you." She heard the desperation in her own words. She had no real plan, only a desperate hope that some piece of Arya remained. For a moment, Arya's lips parted, as though moved by an invisible wind. A flicker of regret shone in her eyes. Then the blue glow intensified again. She shook her head slowly. "There is no help," she said, voice tight with the faintest tremor. "Submit or I will destroy you all. I don't want to spill your blood, but I must serve the great other." A chorus of murmurs ran through the defenders. Many were horrified to see Arya Stark like this, though some had suspected. Sansa steadied herself, refusing to let heartbreak paralyze her. She spoke as calmly as she could, projecting her voice over the walls. "We will not submit to darkness. Please, Arya, fight whatever holds you. Remember who you are." Arya winced, as though the words stabbed her. The wind whipped her hair around her face. "I remember," she whispered, so soft that few could hear. Then, with a sudden surge of cold, her voice rang out again, firm and unyielding. "But it does not matter. Lower your weapons and open the gate, or I will tear this castle stone from stone." Sansa had no reply, only sorrow. At her signal, archers knocked arrows, and a flaming arrow arced into the trench, igniting the oil. Flames roared up, forming a barrier of fire between the walls and the undead. Sansa hoped the flames would deter them, perhaps by time. But Arya stared at the blaze with cold detachment. She raised her hand, and from the ranks of whites emerged a cluster of skeletal figures carrying chunks of ice and snow, casting them onto the flames, gradually smothering sections of the trench. Then more whites rolled forward, a massive block of frozen river water, a makeshift ramp bridging the burning ditch. In horror, the defenders watched as the whites advanced over the diminishing flames. The fight began. Arrows rained down, felling dozens of the undead, but it mattered little. They clawed forward. Men on the walls hurled barrels of flaming pitch, but the whites fought through the flames, unstoppable. Soon, grappling hooks latched onto the battlements, and the undead began to climb. Arya stood back, letting the horde breach the fortress. The White Walkers strode among them, each forging a path of ice. She felt the presence in her mind urging her to move forward, to take the castle for her own. But some part of her still resisted. Memories of her childhood here, the family she had lost and found again, weighed on her like invisible chains. She remained outside for a time, watching the carnage. She felt neither pity nor triumph, only a cold sense of purpose. On the ramparts, Sansa fought with a bow and arrow. She was not an accomplished warrior, but she refused to hide in the crypts. Around her, knights of the north swung swords in a desperate struggle. Screams filled the air. Dozens died in minutes, their bodies reanimating within moments to join the undead tide unless burned. A small band of soldiers managed to hold one section of the wall with well-timed fire attacks, but the rest of the castle soon fell. Whites poured through the gates, unstoppable. Courtyards filled with the dead. The living retreated deeper into the keep, barricading corridors. Sansa found herself backed into a hallway leading to the Great Hall, accompanied by a handful of guards. She could hear the shrieks of the dying, the wails of the newly bereaved. Fear threatened to consume her, but she recalled her mother's strength and Robb's brave heart. She would not yield. She ordered the guards to form a shield wall. Flames from fallen torches licked the tapestries, setting them alight. The castle was becoming an inferno of ice and fire. Then Arya entered Winterfell. She walked through the ruined gates, stepping over bodies and smoldering timbers. Whites parted before her. The castle's familiar corridors stretched out like a labyrinth. She heard echoes of the past. Her father calling her name in the courtyard, her siblings laughing at dinner, her own footsteps racing to her lessons with Syrio Farrell in her mind. The presence in her chest raged, pressing her onward. The Great Other demanded the fall of House Stark, a final victory over the symbol of the First Men's resilience. She encountered no living until she reached the Great Hall. The doors were barricaded from within, but she merely motioned, and the Whites tore them down with relentless strength. Inside, Sansa and a small band of survivors waited with torches, swords, axes, anything that could serve as a weapon. The hall was dim, lit by scattered fires from toppled braziers. Smoke choked the air. Arya stepped inside, the Whites forming behind her. Sansa stood at the far end, trembling but resolute. The two sisters locked eyes. Arya's face was a mask of sorrow and ice, while Sansa's was etched with grief and desperate hope. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sansa took a hesitant step forward, ignoring the pleas of her guards to stay back. "Arya," she said softly, "if there's any part of you left in there, please, we're your family." Arya's lips parted, a tremor passing through her. She remembered it all in that instant. The quiet nights by the hearth, the arguments, the love, the dance of two sisters who had once hated and needed each other in equal measure. She longed to cast aside the Great Other's hold, to collapse in Sansa's arms and beg forgiveness. But the presence in her mind roared, shackling her heart in ice. "There is no family," Arya said, her voice quivering. "Only death." Sansa felt tears burning her cheeks. She heard the rattle of the Whites behind Arya, eager to destroy. She saw the flickering of blue fire in Arya's eyes. Yet she could not take another life of someone she loved. Not again. "Then kill me?" she whispered, voice firm yet thick with sorrow. Arya stared at her, a war raging behind her icy gaze. She felt the Great Other's will, commanding her to strike, to extinguish this last light of House Stark. Yet deep inside, a child whimpered in darkness, a child who had prayed to come home one day. "I can't," Arya breathed. Her dagger hand twitched, paralyzed by indecision. One of the White Walkers stepped forward, as if to finish the job itself. Sansa's guards braced for a final stand, but Arya turned on the White Walker with shocking speed. Her dagger flashed, and in one fluid motion, she sliced through its frosty helm, the Valyrian steel biting deep. The walker shrieked, exploding into shards of ice. Silence fell in the great hall. Everyone stared, uncertain whether this was some flicker of rebellion or a trap. Arya's breathing was ragged, the dagger shaking in her hand. She had defied the Great Other's will for one precious second. She had spared Sansa. The presence in her mind seethed, punishing her with waves of piercing cold. She let out a cry of pain, staggering to one knee. The whites around her snarled, but did not move, apparently awaiting direction from a higher authority. The other White Walkers had not yet reached the hall. Sansa dared to approach, ignoring the protests of her guards. She knelt beside Arya, placing a trembling hand on her shoulder. Arya's eyes flickered, half-lidded, her face twisted in anguish. "Sansa," she gasped, "I can't fight it." She felt the Great Other's fury threatening to rip her soul apart. The seed of the Night King inside her demanded obedience. It would not be denied. "Run," she pleaded in a thin whisper. "Get away." Sansa shook her head, tears falling. "Not without you." She tried to pull Arya close, tried to offer warmth. But even as she did so, she felt a terrible chill emanating from Arya's body, like hugging a statue of ice. A ripple of motion passed through the whites, as though a single will commanded them. They surged forward, and the guards rushed to intercept them, swords clanging. The hall erupted in chaos. Sansa cried out, but she kept her arms around Arya, refusing to let go. Arya gritted her teeth, summoning the last dregs of her free will. She managed to raise the dagger again, hissing a command that froze half the whites in place. But she knew she could not hold them all forever. She was losing the internal battle. Her vision swam, her mind battered by the Great Other's unstoppable wave. In one final act of desperation, Arya pressed the Valyrian steel dagger into Sansa's hand. She looked into her sister's eyes, tears of blood running from her own as the cold power overwhelmed her. "End me," she pleaded, voice raw. "Before I—" But the Great Other roared through her nerves, locking her muscles. Her eyes blazed bright blue again, and her hand caught Sansa's wrist, preventing the dagger from plunging in. The presence forced Arya to stand, overshadowing her mind, pushing her away from self-destruction. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. She was a puppet now, the string of free will snapped. With terrifying strength, she flung Sansa aside. The dagger clattered to the ground, sliding across the icy floor. Sansa sprawled, dazed. The whites pressed in. The guards fell. Firelight flickered across the walls. Outside, the rest of the castle was overrun. Arya advanced on Sansa, face devoid of mercy, a single tear frozen on her cheek. She could sense the presence commanding her. "Kill her. Prove your loyalty." Her hand reached for the nearest weapon, a broken spear lying amid the chaos. Before she could strike, a shape lunged between them. A battered soldier, cloak aflame, thrusting a sword at Arya's chest. She sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing him by the throat. Her grip, powered by inhuman strength, crushed his windpipe. He collapsed, dead. Then she turned to finish Sansa. But Sansa had seized the dagger from the floor. With trembling hands, she held it before her. The Valyrian steel still glinted with the faint memory of magic. The sisters locked eyes, and for a moment, time slowed. They both knew how this would end. Arya's last spark of humanity, buried deep beneath the ice, screamed soundlessly for release. Yet the Great Other guided Arya's body. She wrenched the spear back, preparing a fatal thrust. Sansa raised the dagger with shaking hands, tears spilling freely. Their eyes met, sister to sister, one enslaved by darkness, one desperate to save what remained. The moment hung suspended in heartbreak. A thunderous crash shook the great hall doors. Another White Walker stepped through, tall and regal, bearing an ice-forged sword. Behind it, more whites streamed in. The Walker's icy gaze fell upon the tableau. Arya poised to kill Sansa. It raised its sword in silent approval as if to say, "Complete the task." Arya lunged. Sansa thrust the dagger forward in a desperate attempt to survive. But Arya twisted at the last moment, her unnatural reflexes allowing her to evade the blade's lethal point. She seized Sansa's wrist, forcing the dagger away. They struggled, the sisters locked in a deadly dance. Sansa tried to push the blade back toward Arya's heart, tears blurring her vision. But Arya's strength was unholy. Slowly, inexorably, she overpowered Sansa, bending her arm outward until Sansa howled in pain, dropping the dagger. The Valyrian steel clattered on the floor. Arya held the spear at Sansa's chest, the tip scraping against the embroidered fabric. Sansa's lips trembled, her eyes wide, as she stared into the face of her sister, who was no longer herself. She felt the cold radiating from Arya's skin. This was the end. She closed her eyes, bracing for the strike. In that final heartbeat, something impossible happened. Arya's eyes flickered from blue to brown for the briefest instant. A shudder ran through her frame. The spear in her hand wavered. She tried to speak, but only a broken sob emerged. The presence battered her, screaming for her to finish it. She could not break the Great Other's hold completely, but for 1 second, she found enough of herself to alter the angle of her blow. The spear descended, not into Sansa's heart, but into her shoulder, pinning her to the ground without delivering a fatal wound. Sansa screamed in agony, her blood spilling on the stone. The whites surged forward, drawn by the scent of flesh, but Arya snarled at them, halting them in their tracks with a single commanding gesture. The White Walker who had entered bared its teeth in a silent hiss, as though dissatisfied with Arya's hesitation. It advanced, intending to finish Sansa itself. Arya spun on it, fury igniting in her eyes. She took up the Valyrian steel dagger from the ground and hurled it with all her might. The dagger found its mark, piercing the walker's chest. The creature howled, shattering into a burst of icy shards. For the second time, Arya had disobeyed the Great Other's will. A maelstrom of cold hammered her mind, punishing her. She staggered, pressing her hands to her temples, letting out a ragged scream. The whites in the hall twitched, caught between conflicting commands. The overall directive to kill, and the champion's direct order to stand down. For a moment, chaos reigned. Sansa lay wounded, the guards either dead or dying. Flames danced on the walls. Then the Great Other's hold slammed down harder, retaking full control of Arya. Her eyes blazed a deeper blue. She stood over Sansa's prone form, panting. She realized that she could not remain here, constantly fighting that last fragment of her humanity. The Great Other demanded absolute submission, but some traitorous spark still lived within her. If she stayed, that spark might grow, might cause her to falter again. She turned to the whites, uttering a single word in that cold, inhuman voice. At once, they swarmed forward, ignoring Sansa for the moment. They moved to secure the rest of the castle, to finish the slaughter of the living. Several parted to let Arya pass as she hurried from the hall. 1 or 2 turned back to lunge at Sansa, but in a rare moment of mercy, Arya hissed a command, halting them. She spared Sansa's life, though it would likely mean death in the end if no help arrived. Her reasoning was unclear even to herself. Perhaps it was some flicker of the old Arya that refused to extinguish her own blood. Perhaps she believed that letting Sansa live would prove her power over the Great Other's impulses. A small rebellion. Or maybe it was a crueler sentence, leaving Sansa to bleed out slowly. The truth was tangled in the labyrinth of Arya's enslaved mind. She departed Winterfell as swiftly as she had come, riding a black horse whose eyes glowed faintly with the same eerie power. The undead legion followed, leaving behind a broken castle, half in flames, corpses littering the halls. Some whites remained, commanded to hold the fortress as a foothold for the Great Other's dominion. LL clinging to hope, forging a fragile alliance with southern lords who recognized the threat. She wrote letters to Jon, begging him to rally his southern allies and return to face the apocalypse. She described what had become of Arya, her sorrow palpable in every penned word. She still believed that if Arya could be reached, perhaps she could be saved. But with each day, that hope dimmed. The unstoppable horde continued south. The Vale attempted to mount a defense at the Bloody Gate, but the whites scaled the cliffs with horrifying persistence. Some knights found themselves battling former comrades resurrected as undead. The Knights of the Vale, famed for their valor, were slaughtered and raised to fight again. The area itself remained out of reach high on its mountain perch, but that hardly mattered to the unstoppable tide. They bypassed it, leaving a token force of whites to besiege it while the main army pressed on. The Riverlands became a hellscape of burning villages and blackened fields. Lords who had survived the War of the Five Kings had little strength left. Raventree Hall, Riverrun, and others made valiant stands, but the outcome was inevitable. Where armies formed, Arya would appear, leading swift strikes that dismantled them. The presence inside her thirsted for destruction, and she carried out its will with the skill of a master assassin. She rarely took the field in open battle, preferring to slip behind lines and assassinate key commanders. Fear spread faster than the plague of undeath. Soldiers abandoned their posts rather than face the unstoppable champion. Through all this, Arya's memories of who she had been did not entirely fade. They lingered like ghosts whispering regrets. Sometimes she would see the face of a child she once spared or the memory of her father's final smile. It tugged at her soul, forming hairline fractures in the great other's dominion. But each time, the presence clamped down, punishing her with cold that felt like her bones were cracking. She grew wary of indulging those memories, for the pain was too great. Better to remain numb. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, chaos reigned. Some urged the new monarch, whoever that might be in this post-war realm, to flee. Others insisted on making a stand behind the city's walls, trusting in the might of the Crownlands to hold off the tide. Raven after raven arrived, each with more dire reports from the north. The small folk prayed to the Seven, to the Lord of Light, even to the drowned god, for deliverance. There was no consensus among the lords, no single power to unite them. The realm had been left fractured after the recent wars. By the time Arya's undead legions reached the Trident, the combined armies of several great houses had finally mustered to meet them. Cavalry from the Reach, infantry from the Stormlands, archers from Dorne, and the last remnants of the north that had managed to survive. Some Targaryen loyalists even brought dragons, if any survived after the chaotic events of recent years. But it all seemed hopeless. The cold that accompanied Arya's army twisted the land, summoning storms of ice that grounded dragons and extinguished torches. In the swirling snow, the living lines broke. Whites poured through, unstoppable. Somewhere on that battlefield, Sansa marched with her battered northern bannermen, determined to fight to the end. She wore dark furs, her hair braided in the northern style. She stood upon a small rise, watching the carnage as the lines collapsed. She had no illusions that victory was possible. She only hoped to find Arya, to try one last time to break her sister free, or, if it was truly hopeless, to grant her a merciful death. And find her she did, just after the last of the cavalry was scattered. Arya stood amid heaps of corpses, whites prowling at her side. She wore no crown, but the air around her shimmered with the great other's power. Her eyes glowed like twin stars of winter. Her once warm face had grown paler, her features sharpened by unholy grace. She saw Sansa standing on that rise, a beacon of defiance in a world gone dark. They locked eyes across the field. For a moment, all other sound faded. Sansa could see the faint quiver in Arya's lips, the old sorrow in her stance. She raised her sword, no fine lady's weapon, but a battered blade taken from a fallen guard. She stepped forward, alone, leaving the rest of her men behind. The whites snarled but held back, waiting for their champion's command. "Arya," Sansa called, her voice trembling with emotion. "If you can still hear me, please, end this. This isn't who you are." Arya stared, a storm of conflict behind her glowing eyes. She remembered their father brushing Sansa's hair, remembered the days they bickered over sewing versus swordplay, remembered the nights they huddled together in the great hall, frightened of the future, yet united by blood. She felt the great other's presence roiling inside her, commanding her to destroy this last vestige of her old life. Her body tensed. "Take her," the presence whispered in her mind, though it did not speak with words. It urged her forward, promised her endless power, the final victory, if she could only sever this last chain to her mortal past. Frost crackled around her boots. She advanced on Sansa, dagger in hand. Sansa did not move to flee or fight. She only held her sword at the ready, tears in her eyes. "It doesn't have to end this way," she managed. "It does," Arya whispered, voice carrying across the dead field. She lunged. Their blades met in a resounding clash, echoing in the still air. Sansa was no match for Arya in skill, but her desperation and heartbreak gave her fleeting strength. She parried once, twice, then Arya's next blow knocked the sword from her hands. Sansa fell to her knees, glaring up with tears streaming down her cheeks. Arya pressed the dagger to Sansa's throat, ready to finish it. Time stood still. The wind howled across the battlefield, carrying the moans of the wounded, the whisper of the dead. Sansa's eyes were wide, her breath ragged. "I love you," she said softly. "No matter what. I'm sorry for everything." A tremor ran through Arya's arm. Her eyes flickered from blue to brown, then back again. She could not speak. The great Other's will demanded blood. Her own battered soul clung to a final shred of humanity. Sansa closed her eyes, waiting for the blow. Around them, whites shifted anxiously, hungry for the kill. Arya's dagger remained still against Sansa's throat. Her mind was a hurricane of darkness and memory. She did not want to do this. She did want to do it. She wanted it to be over. She wanted to kill everything. She wanted to save everyone. She let out a strangled sob. Then the great Other roared in fury, tightening its grip. Arya's hand began to press forward. But before the blade could cut deep, an echo of a voice cut through the chaos in Arya's mind. It was their father's voice, as if carried by the wind from another age. "When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives." The memory of that phrase, the resonance of a father's love, was enough to give Arya one last moment of clarity. She snarled, rearing back, trying to tear the dagger from Sansa's throat. The great Other's presence lashed at her, punishing her with blasts of agony. She howled, staggering away from her sister, turning the blade inward toward her own chest. "I can't let this," she gasped. She raised the dagger, meaning to plunge it into her heart and end it once and for all. But the great Other was faster. Her body froze. The dagger trembled inches from her chest, refusing to move. The presence battered her mind, subduing her limbs. She dropped to her knees, fingers locked around the weapon, neither able to drive it in nor cast it aside. Whites crept forward to protect their champion, forming a defensive ring around her. Sansa watched, tears coursing down her face, powerless to help. She saw Arya's entire body convulse as the internal battle raged. Then, with a final anguished scream, Arya lost. The dagger clattered from her hand. She sank to the ground, eyes blazing blue, tears of ice trailing down her cheeks. The whites parted to let her stand. She picked up the dagger, but now there was no hesitation or sorrow in her face, only the cold finality of doom. The champion's will had become one with the great Other. Sansa saw the flicker of mercy die in Arya's expression. She thought she heard a faint whisper of apology. Then Arya moved. In one lightning-quick motion, she slashed Sansa's throat. Blood spattered across the trampled snow. Sansa's eyes went wide, her lips parted in shock. She fell forward into Arya's arms, choking on her own blood. Arya held her gently, almost tenderly, and Sansa gazed up at her sister with a final look of heartbreak, struggling to mouth words that would not come. Within seconds, her eyes went still. The battlefield was silent. Arya cradled her sister's lifeless body, the last tears she would ever shed freezing on her cheeks. The great Other's victory was complete. Whatever fraction of Arya Stark remained now lay dead in her arms. She set Sansa's body down with reverent care. Then she rose, turning to the whites. She could sense the great Other's satisfaction. The living's last, best hope had died with Sansa. In the distance, the few survivors fled in panic. Arya did not order the whites to pursue. The Great Other already knew the end was certain. The realm was broken, its unification undone, its armies scattered. The final harvest would be a matter of time. She left the battlefield, taking the army of the dead south. City after city, castle after castle fell before the unstoppable tide. Jon Snow, or any other leader who might have rallied the last of humanity, arrived too late with too few forces. Courage and swords availed them nothing. Dragons, if any survived, could not burn an entire continent of the dead. The kingdom collapsed like a castle of sand before a roaring sea. Where the dead passed, winter followed, and no spring would ever thaw that ice. In the end, Arya Stark stood upon the ruins of King's Landing. The Red Keep lay in broken heaps of stone. Corpses littered the streets. The Great Other's presence suffused everything in a curtain of eternal night. Snow fell year-round, blanketing the blackened rubble. Arya ascended the remnants of the Iron Throne's dais, though the throne itself was shattered. She gazed upon the city. Thousands of wights filled the streets in silent vigil, awaiting her command. Among them lurked White Walkers, each bowing to their champion. She remembered 1,000 faces, 1,000 moments of mortal life. Her mother's gentle touch, Gendry's grin, the hound's gruff curses, Jaqen Hagar's cryptic words, Sansa's warmth, Bran's thoughtful silence, Jon's protective embrace. All of it was as distant as a dream. She closed her eyes, feeling only the Great Other's will, the primal force of ice and darkness that had chosen her as its vessel. She raised her arms, and an unnatural wind howled through the city. The dead stirred, an entire continent's worth of corpses moving as one. The last flames guttered out. The sun sank behind an endless pall of storm clouds. The war was over, and darkness had won. The pack had not survived. The long night had come forever. Arya Stark was gone, lost in the embrace of the Great Other. What remained was the champion of a doom that would never end, a slow freeze of all life beneath the rule of ice. Perhaps, in some far corner of her shattered soul, a child still cried out for home, for a father's warm hand, for a sister's smile. But no one would ever hear that cry. Westeros lay silent under the snowfall, its people and its memory vanquished, as the champion stood on the ruins of the throne that once ruled the Seven Kingdoms. Thus ended the world of men, with the last hero turned harbinger of eternal night, and no songs would ever remember the warmth that had been.